Verite Research is an independent think tank based in Sri Lanka, providing strategic analysis for Asia in areas of economics, law, and media. But our work goes beyond just research and analysis. We also develop innovative tools and platforms to promote transparency, accountability, and good governance in the country. Verite Research Sri Lanka Economic Policy Group comprises of top economists in the field such as our very own Dr. Nishanti Mel, Dr. Shanta Devarajan, Dr. Dilani Gunawardana, and Dr. Mick Moore. They've published 6 data-driven publications covering a range of topics from taxation to debt restructuring to social targeting and governance. The main aim of this group is to both inform and educate the public as well as engage with the government and policymakers to assist in sound decision making. Publicfinance.lk is Verite Research's platform for public finance related information in Sri Lanka. It aims to bridge the gap in information and understanding of public finance by providing insights and analysis on Sri Lanka's public finance. We have also developed 3 interactive dashboards under publicfinance.lk to provide a real-time information on government performance, fuel prices, and infrastructure projects. Mantri.lk is another one of our innovations. It is the only one of its kind in South Asia, a pioneering trilingual website which profiles the actions and activities of each of the 225 members of the Parliament of Sri Lanka. Now, as a MP monitoring scorecard, Mantri.lk recognizes the need for accountability between MPs and the electorates. In doing so, it seeks to promote transparency and good governance to improve Sri Lanka's democratic framework. Finally, Verite Media, which offers a diverse range of platforms to improve public understanding of media and information in Sri Lanka. These include factcheck.lk, the Media Analysis, Front Page, and Ethics Eye, which monitors and analyzes media practices and provides insights into the pulse of Sinhala and Tamil-speaking public. At Verite Research, we believe that research and analysis are only a part of the solution. We strive to develop innovative platforms and tools that promote transparency, accountability, and good governance in Sri Lanka.
Hello, my name is Ishani and I'm here to tell you about airquality.lk. There's very little research on air quality and its impact on our health, the environment and economy in Sri Lanka. However, globally, there's plenty of studies that indicate that air quality and poor air quality has a massive impact on our lives and our communities. So this ranges from our impacts on our respiratory health to mental health, productivity and more. So we'd really like Sri Lankans to start taking this problem more seriously and to help safeguard themselves. Airquality.lk is a platform that helps to build awareness on the risks of polluted air, help the public safeguard their health, and work towards driving policy reform that will help us clean up the air we breathe. Firstly, we have a live map that draws data from a sensor network which is across the country, and this will give you near real-time data and get an understanding of the air quality in your area. We also have an alert system that will give you an understanding of the changes to the air quality in your surrounding area. We're also working on a portal that will allow researchers and interested individuals to request historical data. As a first step, go check out our website and then go explore the map, see where all the air quality sensors are around the country, and then sign up to our alert system that'll help you take care of yourself and others. You can also be part of our cleaner air movement and help us grow the air quality sensor network, and by creating awareness among your family, friends, schools on the importance of managing and tracking air quality.
Senior Research Analyst Econ at Verite Research, Sumini Siamalapitia, joined me in the studio for some startling revelations. Now, your research focused on costs incurred by urban women in Sri Lanka, basically the cost of doing a job. Why did you focus on urban women?
The reason that our study looked at costs incurred by urban women is because one, in terms of just practically doing this sort of research study, it just made sense to focus on where the formal labor market was more focused, which was in urban areas. Particularly, we focused on the Western province. But also, this was more of a pilot study, considering the fact that this type of study, where we try to quantify the monetary and non-monetary costs incurred by women, had not been conducted before.
So, in a quantifiable sense, what were your findings?
So, to put it all very shortly, every 100 rupees that urban women earn in Sri Lanka costs them 160 rupees, which is pretty significant.
So there are no established guidelines or regulations when it comes to the provision of childcare, which I saw in your research was one of the biggest problems that urban women had. But there are countries that have instituted regulations and standards for childcare, Singapore being one. What have been the tangible benefits that Singapore as a country has had because of introducing these things?
So countries like Singapore, what they did right is not just think of this in terms of, oh, we're doing this to benefit women, but how is this an economically smart decision, and how is this a long-term decision to really build our human capital in terms of our future citizens and our future workforce. Starting from that point, they regulated the childcare industry, because one of the main issues that we found, and is generally also an accepted issue worldwide, is that women and families are very hesitant to trust childcare centers. So how do you bridge that trust deficit? And then once you bridge that, how do you make childcare affordable? And when you bridge those issues for families, and you also make sure that quality childcare is made sure that children's development is guaranteed, those are the things that Singapore did. And as a result, like, you see that about almost 65% of Singapore's adult women are in the formal labor market. And this is more than double what Sri Lanka has. Sri Lanka is really poor in this area. We're only 31%, and it's a number that has stagnated for decades now. Their economic success is a result of also a lot of inclusive policies that aren't just, oh, we're being nice to women, but we're really doing this because it's the smart thing to do, and it's what guarantees a successful workforce both in the future and the present. You need to start understanding the exact issues that women face in participating in the labor force, and that comes from understanding that the costs they incur are not just the monetary rupee cost, that there's a very much of a hidden cost. They take on a disproportionate amount of unpaid labor within the home, even when they're engaged in paid labor outside the home. And acknowledging this fact, and sort of while we try to bridge the amount of unpaid labor women take on, trying to meet sort of women in the middle, where we offer more mainstream options like flexible working, part-time working, flexible hours, working from home.
Some of the other reasons that women don't go to work, apart from child and the responsibilities in the house, is because of transport. And I think surveys have shown that women going on public transport have been sexually harassed. That's another issue that women actually face. Particularly, I would like to emphasize the transport space, because that's another thing that keeps women away from work, because one is the cost of transport and the affordability, and the second thing is that they don't feel secure. So when they weigh up, the cost benefit, they think it's better probably not to work. And therefore, society has a responsibility.
Testing, yes. Hi, everyone. So glad to have you in the room. But this event is a hybrid event, but it is primarily an online event. So I just want to say good evening from Sri Lanka to all of you who have joined us online today to this very important conversation we are going to have. I think we've advertised it as a conversation between two different paradigms of thinking about solutions. So we're looking forward to the solutions of how Sri Lanka can better navigate its debt and economic crisis. I'm not the moderator, I'm just a facilitator, I'm playing a minor role today. I'm going to start by introducing the people in the order that they will speak. And we are going to have our international moderator speak first, and I will introduce each one. So Ravi Kanbur is moderating from the United States today, and he will come online and you should be able to see him. Ravi is the T.H. Lee Professor of World Affairs, International Professor of Applied Economics and Professor of Economics at Cornell University. He researches and teaches in development economics, public economics, and economic theory. He's well known for his role in policy analysis and engagement in international development. He has served on as senior staff of the World Bank, including as chief economist for Africa. He has also published in the leading economic journals, including Journal of Political Economy, American Economic Review, Review of Economic Studies, Journal of Economic Theory, and Economic Journal. Many of you who are in the development field and who are economists are familiar with Ravi. I think myself and several people I see here, we grew up reading the work of people like Ravi and were shaped by it. So we are so grateful that he's taken this role of moderating, guiding, and trying to pull together this important conversation we are going to have today. Next, the next speaker and the first speaker that we have is Jayati Ghosh, is an Indian development economist. She taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, we normally say JNU, and New Delhi for nearly 35 years. And since January of 2021, she has been professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, UMass Amherst. She is part of the WHO Council on the Economics of Health for All and the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. That group is mandated to provide a vision for international cooperation to deal with current and future challenges. So in the spirit of cooperation, constructive engagement, I think which is run, and Jayati embraces that in the positions that she holds. So we have in person with us here today on stage with me, our second speaker, Professor Shantanu Devarajan. He's professor of the practice of international development at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Shanta, like Ravi, also held very senior positions at the World Bank. He was the senior director for development economics, the chief economist of 3 regions. So Ravi was chief economist for Africa, Shanta was chief economist for the Middle East, North Africa, and also the South Asian regions and Human Development Network. When I first met Shanta, I can't remember whether it was 6 or 7 years ago, Shanta was trying to retire from the bank, but they kept him back as the acting chief economist of the World Bank itself. And that was reflected in the fantastic corner office that I was taken to when Shanta heard I was in the building. He invited to have an engagement. So Shanta, even then, while being a global figure and chief economist or acting chief economist of the World Bank, was very keen and interested about Sri Lanka, which is why he sort of pulled me out of some other meeting and said, let's talk about Sri Lanka. And since then, he's become a non-resident fellow of Verite Research. And we are really glad for his guidance and his incisive thinking. He's also, as you know, one of the 3 members of the Advisory Council to the President of Sri Lanka. Both the previous president who decided to resign and the current president, they've continued on that path to guide the president's understanding and thinking through resolving the economic crisis. And their role really, I think, because I know a little bit about it, is also to maintain continuity in the international engagement with Sri Lanka and provide confidence, which I think they've done in an impressive way. The next speaker will be Ishac Diwan. Actually, I made a mistake in how I thought the order.
Ishac goes first.
I apologize. So actually, Ishac will speak first and Jayati will speak third, okay? Because we had our posters with Jayati at the top, and I made that mistake. So Ishac will actually speak first, and we were just seeing Ishac on the screen. Hi, Ishac, yeah. Ishac is Research Director of the Finance for Development Lab at the Paris School of Economics. He's also in charge of the Political Economy Program of the Economic Research Forum, an association of Middle East social scientists. Ishac teaches economics at Ecole Normale Superieure in Paris. And we've had a chance to engage with Ishac in preparation for this event. And, I think we were really impressed by the level of experience and wisdom that he brought into the conversation. The last person I want to introduce is Shamini Kure, who also, with Shanta, is part of the advisory panel to the President of Sri Lanka. She's a former department director of the International Monetary Fund and is currently a member of the Presidential Advisory Group, as I said, and it's called the Group on Multilateral Engagement and Debt Sustainability, advising the government of Sri Lanka. And that's the role they played. Her experience at the IMF includes surveillance and program work in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Western Hemisphere, as well as fund policy work. She holds a PhD and bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard University. Sorry, Shamini, I didn't realize that we had something in common there. But what I want to say is that Shamini has enormous on-the-ground experience in debt restructuring. The stories she will tell today about her experience of handling very specific debt restructuring cases, I think, are also going to be informative. So that is the panel. I think we have just had, y'all will get my slides up, yeah. We have just had the IMF program, almost approved, or the signal that it's going to be approved in a couple of weeks, given to us, and while everybody is celebrating, I think this conversation reminds us, or should remind us, that signing up to an IMF program is only a beginning of a long process, right? There's a lot of work that Sri Lanka must do, and which the IMF or others in the world can't do. And recovering from the economic crisis requires various forms of commitment, planning, analysis, and there are different ways in which we can think about how this problem is solved. So some of the speakers today have different views on some of the solution paths that Sri Lanka should take. And our task today, I think, is in the spirit of constructive engagement, learn from the things that we might not have thought about or disagreed with. Personally, I want to say that, a lot of my learning comes from people who disagree with me. And I'm sure it's true for you as well, because that's the way that people make you question your assumptions, question your logic. When people agree with you, it's too easy. So I work at Verite Research, where people are disagreeing with each other all the time. And I think that's what makes us grow. So I think this is not simply about presenting a view or somebody just taking a position. This is about listening, engaging constructively, and growing in the understanding of what is possible and what is what we should be probably embracing for the future of debt restructuring in the world, but especially focused on the solutions for Sri Lanka. So you have the title in front of you. It says Improving Solutions for Sri Lanka in Sri Lanka's debt and economic crisis. Some of you saw a video that was played before, or you're going to play it now? Yeah. But I'm going to quickly say, I'm going to talk about 3 problems that Sri Lanka has, very briefly. And the first one is evident from the fact that we are coming now into the 17th IMF program, okay? So the first is the commitment problem. And I'm not going to talk about why we are in repeated IMF programs. I'm going to talk about our own laws, and I'm going to say it very fast because the insight that has all this written up is something you can collect outside, and I'll give you a QR code to download it. But what this shows you, that Sri Lanka passed a law for fiscal management responsibility in 2002 and breached its own law every single year in terms of the deficit that it would run. And this shows you what the promised commitment was, and the yellow line shows you what Sri Lanka actually did. It was breached every single year since the law was passed. It had targets for central government debt and how it would be reduced, but every time it came close to having to achieve the reduced target, the government just changed the law. So the rule became not a rule at all. It just got changed to accommodate whatever the behavior was. And the same thing happened with the rule on limiting government guarantees on debt of state-owned enterprises. That whenever the rule looked like it was going to actually be a constraint, the rule was simply changed. So the question of internal commitment, we often think if we pass a law, we will get internal commitment. But Sri Lanka in this problem of commitment shows that you don't necessarily either implement your own laws or you change them in a way that they don't function as commitment devices at all. The second problem that I want to introduce as a precursor to Ravi coming and speaking is, so if you want this paper, there's a QR code here. You can scan it. For those who are physically here, it's outside as well. For those who are watching virtually, you can get to this point and anytime and scan the QR code and download the paper on what I just showed you. Second is I call the Ponzi scheme problem, and I won't go into details about why it's called Ponzi scheme, but it's basically borrowing to repay your borrowers, where you're not investing in a way that makes the money grow. So you're promising somebody a return, but you're not really generating a return, but then you take new borrowing to give the return to the previous people you borrowed from. Now that Sri Lanka was on a Ponzi scheme became evident in another paper that we published, which shows that from 2015 to 19, Sri Lanka increased its debt 42.8%. This is local and international debt combined. But 89.8%, so almost 90% of that increase, went to paying interest only on the debt it had already accumulated. So this was a sign that Sri Lanka was in a Ponzi scheme. And this is published, but this slide is not, and you can download it here. The next slide is not published, and what that shows you is also very interesting. It shows you we did this for 5 years before, and from 2009 to 14, Sri Lanka increased its debt by 83.4% of the previous accumulated debt, and 50% went to pay interest on previous accumulated debt. So you see the Ponzi scheme, it's getting worse. So here you are spending 50%, using 50% on interest, but then whatever you're spending on other projects or other activities is not generating government revenue, either growth and revenue, to an extent that makes debt payment sustainable. So now 89.8% of your borrowing is to pay just interest on previous debt. The last thing I want to tell you is what I call the Peter-Paul problem. You've all heard it. You borrow from Peter to pay Paul. And Sri Lanka did a bit of that too. Because you can see here, what's at the bottom is Sri Lanka's borrowing from bilateral and multilateral debt. So other countries and international organizations like the World Bank and ADB. But you can suddenly see that at some point, Sri Lanka started taking commercial debt. That's from 2007 onwards, okay, 6 and 7. And that's the blue line. And you can see how the commercial debt has grown rather a lot over time. What was going on in this process? So I'm going to just have this slide pay for you. So think about 3 stages. In stage 1, we call it year 1, you take project loans from bilaterals and multilaterals, right? And you say, well, we are going to build something, we're going to construct something. This is not budget support. This is just loans committed to doing something. Then in year 2, you decide you've got to repay these project loans. So you now, usually multilaterals and bilaterals don't give you money to repay. They give you money to build stuff. So when you've got to repay them, you go take commercial loans at this stage, and you repay your bilaterals and multilaterals. That's year 2. Year 3 you have now, you're still taking some more project loans, okay? But by now, you're taking more commercial loans, not only to repay your bilaterals and multilaterals, but also repay the interest on the previous commercial loans you took. So this is what's going on, and I think there are Veritas staff here and Rajakulendran. They've done the math, and here's what you find. It all ended up that the entire stock of commercial loans that Sri Lanka took from 2007 onwards went to pay the loans due to multilaterals and bilaterals and the interest on those commercial loans, and then some. So not even that was all enough. So you can see that of those repayments, 28% went of the commercial loans taken and the interest on those commercial loans, 28% went to pay Japan, 19% to the ADB, 13% to China. So in a way, when you ask the question, what were these commercial loans for? Money is fungible, of course, but these are all international flows. And by commercial loans, I don't mean just international sovereign bonds, also Sri Lanka development bonds. So all the dollar-denominated debt and a tiny amount of budget support from multilaterals. All that budget support money went to settle past project loans that Sri Lanka had taken and the interest on that money that it took. Now, you may say that's surprising that Japan has such a large number. Everybody thought China is the country you repaid. That's, of course, because Japan probably gave us extremely concessional terms over a long period. So Japanese loans in the 80s, 90s, with 30-year repayments became due. And of course, China took a bigger and bigger share as the years went by, but had an extremely small share at the beginning. So you can see repayments to China were 1 or 2% of the repayments in 2007, but it's 24% of the repayment. So I don't think any one country is a problem or there's anything wrong with this, but it is the fact of the matter that if what you build and what you construct is not generating an economic return, and that economic return is not converted into revenue into government, then you are effectively, you're going to borrow from Peter to pay Paul, and you're going to be running a Ponzi scheme because now Peter is offering you commercial interest rates, and there's no sustainability in that. So hence this debt sustainability problem. There are different papers on debt and loans that you can download from Verity Research. This is about how governance was undermined in the process of expending Chinese loans. This is about the level of concessionality. Are they really concessional? Because bilateral loans are often tied to bilateral contractors, so analysis of concessionality. And you can read those. And so as I hand over to Ravi, let me say there are 3 issues that we at tension right now for Sri Lanka. The urgency, the longer you take to solve the problems, the more you live without confidence, without investment, without economic growth. But there's also the problem of acceptability. Is what you're going to do acceptable to society? Is it sustainable in a social sense? Does it make sense? Is it analytically acceptable? But there's also durability. Are you trying to get a quick solution fast that won't last? Or are you really working at a solution that is durable? Because many countries don't restructure debt just once. In the last 50 years, only 50% of the countries have managed with a single restructure. They end up doing it again. And how do you avoid that repeated restructure process? So, my contribution ends here because really we have some great speakers from all over the world. And I'm going to just hand over to Ravi, maybe to give a more substantive introduction to how we are going to engage and take the conversation forward. And then we'll move to Ishac and Shanta, Jayati and Shamini, and Ravi is going to run the rest of the program for us. Ravi, over to you.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, Nishan, and thank you for the invitation and thank you for organizing this event. Given the excellent introduction by Nishan, who actually laid out the issue, it's not clear what more I can say. But let me just, in some sense, repeat and underline some of the points that Nishan made. As Nishan started saying, the IMF program now looks as though it's going to be approved very soon. So in some sense, the very short-term problem of liquidity and access and so on is being addressed. But of course, this is a very, very short term, and the question is what now happens going forward, and that's what we should be thinking about. And how should Sri Lanka go forward and build on this? And what should be the key elements of the program as we go forward? And how should we make sure that we don't get into this cycle of problems again, as Sri Lanka has in the past? And also, I think an associated issue is what are the lessons of the Sri Lanka experience for the incorporation of international financial institutions in their engagement with countries like Sri Lanka. I mean, we have the experience of Lebanon and of Zambia and Ghana and so on. That's a broader set of issues going beyond Sri Lanka's own experience. So let me just to kick things. I mean, we have a great panel, of course, here with Ishac and Jayati and Shanta and Shamini. So we look forward to a great discussion. But let me just pose a couple of questions for the panel to be thinking about. Firstly, focusing on Sri Lanka's Sri Lanka specific program, what do we think about the appropriate level of fiscal deficit, or perhaps one should say the primary fiscal surplus, and the speed with which that should be approached? Are those restrictions too tight in the current situation? Is one question that we might pose. The second class of questions is given this deficit, taking that as given, the composition of that between revenue and expenditure, and within expenditure, different types of expenditure. And in that, let me pose two sub-questions, which is enough attention being paid to long-run issues, for example, investment to address climate change and so on, sufficiently long-term issue, not just very short-term issue. And the second class of questions is, how is the particular expenditure on poverty reduction being deployed? Is it being deployed appropriately? And here we run into a question of the debate on targeting of transfers, in-kind versus cash, those sorts of issues. So those are some general questions on Sri Lanka. And then at the international level, let me pose the question of the role of international agencies in monitoring and, in some sense, I suppose, enforcing the commitment. Ishan pointed to how the Sri Lankan government's own commitments were not met to their own people. They passed laws which were not followed. What is the role of international agencies in this process? Should they stay out of it? And if they're going to be in it, how should they interact then with the domestic processes of commitment? And this touches on of course, on the fundamental issue of conditionality, nature of conditionality, and how to operate it. And just finally, this also then leads to the question of the legitimacy of international institutions in playing this role, if in fact the composition of their boards is very much tilted towards the composition of the world economy in 1945, not the composition of the world economy in 2023. So let me stop there and open up the discussions and see how our panelists address those questions, and of course any other questions that they want to put on the table, and then we'll come back to another round. Yeah. So let me then turn to Ishac, I believe, is the next speaker. Ishac, take over, please.
Thank you.
And we've told all our speakers, just a reminder, we'd like you to try to keep opening remarks to 7 minutes. We are not going to police that too much. We're going to trust your judgment if you need a little more time. But
no, Nishan, no. Be assured that I will police it.
Okay.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'll try to keep to 7 minutes or less. It's very humbling to be starting that I don't know Sri Lanka very well, but it's good to be among friends. I'm inspired to talk from two perspectives. Is there too much echo? Yes. I don't know. Is there any particular way we can all mute? Or?
It's okay.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. So I want to speak from two perspectives. One is a recent paper at the Economic Association that I wrote that focuses on the role of growth even in these stabilization programs, to try to make the pie larger as opposed to focusing too much on austerity. And the second angle is my Lebanese experience. I've participated a lot with civil society in trying to shape the response to the crisis. Unfortunately, we were terribly unsuccessful, but maybe learn something from that experience. So 3 points only I want to make. One on the international situation that Ravi asked about, the role of the MDBs. A few comments on the domestic situation, and especially the combination of the need for economic and political change. And finally, just to comment on the moment, the importance of that particular moment. Internationally, we need to recognize that we are at a special time after more than a decade of easy credit. Easy credit from the markets, because they were flushed with liquidity, Eurobond market in particular. Easy credit from China that came in with its PRI in 2000s and then massively to developing countries. Easy credit followed by a series of shocks. After COVID-19, the Ukrainian war, inflation, the war against inflation, the rise in interest rate, and the fact that all these developing countries that were borrowing a lot were suddenly cut off from the markets, and so have difficulties in refinancing them. And so many countries, like Sri Lanka, now have problems. But they have different kinds of problems. And happiness is different in different countries. Some countries are illiquid, and some are insolvent, so harder problems. And some are simply hit by a temporary shock, while others have really exacerbated problems due to internal mismanagement, and so has revealed, if you like, years of Ponzi, as Nishan said, where borrowing was used to cover up problems. And these are countries that need serious reforms, economic and in some cases political, because this money has had particular bargain, particular elite stay and take advantage of the situation. Very much the case of Lebanon, and from what I hear, the case of Sri Lanka. So that complicates the situation, because what is on the table is not just an economic adjustment, but also politically, potentially, a political adjustment. Now, to complicate things, back to the international scene, the situation is very different from previous debt crisis in that though the creditors are very heterogeneous. You have multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and others, the typical bilaterals, but the new bilaterals also, China, India, in your case, and the market. And that combination has not been seen before. These creditors don't know how to work together. There is no international framework for them to do so. And there is no agreement that was reached. There's a big house called the Common Framework that the G20 put together, but it doesn't really have rules. And the rules are really being negotiated in the negotiation in Zambia and particularly in the negotiation on Sri Lanka. So that makes things even harder for Sri Lanka. The rules are being defined in this particular negotiation. And these are rules that have to do with whether China and the West cooperate, or how do they cooperate, whether the MDBs, the Multilateral Development Bank, take a loss or not, how much domestic creditors should participate in sharing the burden. What is the philosophy of adjustments? You know, how much primary surplus, question Ravi asked, to what extent the country is put in jail to pay more versus how much debt reduction. This is not very well defined. Whether the adjustment plan would focus actually on putting countries back on a growth path, and why not a green growth path with financial commitments by the international community that's been promising to help countries meet the green challenge. So there are lots of questions in the air that will complicate things. And as all the speakers said, this will not be resolved overnight. It will take at least a decade, more than one program. It's a play with several acts. Look at Greece today. 14 years after it went into crisis, it's still fighting to come back to where it was. Now, time is running. Just a few words on the second, the national adjustment. As I said, the big challenge that we've seen in Lebanon is whether to do the political adjustment first or the economic adjustment first, given that we need international support. So the fear is that international support will solidify the old regime and will save it. And so civil society has to think about taking a position. And the alternative is to prevent the national bailout, if you like, and to let the system collapse. But as we've seen in Lebanon, that's not necessarily a good solution. Our system has not collapsed, and we don't have international support. And as a result, we have an adjustment program that really puts all the burden on the population and saves the aid. And so, which comes first is a decision that civil society should make in defining its strategy. And what we haven't done in the case of Lebanon is focus on particular demands, such as having a social safety net or putting in place capital control so capital doesn't escape but is taxed. And so I think this is important for Sri Lanka to decide. Now, the role of civil society, to conclude, is really crucial on the commitment problem that Jean told about. Only civil society can hold the government accountable. The political process is strong. And it's crucial, it seems to me, in trying to find an adjustment solution that takes care of social justice and of the long term. And the moment today is really very grave because there are three possible ways to go, and they will be decided in the next few months. Either Sri Lanka will manage to decisively put a program together that will pick it up with rapid recovery, a deep surgery, if you like, economic and political, like Chile, Brazil, other European countries that managed to escape from their crisis. Or it would be in a situation of a shallow adjustment, of a stop and go, like say Ghana or Egypt or Argentina or Sri Lanka in the past, with multiple programs, one step forward, two step backward, shallow adjustment that never ends. Or finally, the worst case, which is to be stuck in a poverty trap, like the Somalias, the Yemens, the Venezuelas, unfortunately, maybe the Lebanon of this case, where we get a low-level equilibrium with people leaving, a country living on humanitarian support and remittances. And so I think really what's decisive is going to be the position that civil society takes and whether it can come together to define the program and hold the government accountable for this political economy program. Back to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Ishac, for those observations. Let me suggest that we move straight on, go through the panelists, and then we'll come back to the discussion, okay? Next is Shanta on the list.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's nice to be here. Nice to see you, Ravi, Isaac, Jayati, and Sharmini. I will take the framework that Ravi spelled out and try to respond to some of the questions that he posed. First, starting with the Sri Lankan case. The question about the speed with which the fiscal deficit is turned into a fiscal surplus. Now, the reason we need to turn the fiscal deficit into a fiscal surplus is to achieve debt sustainability. It's not something that the IMF wants just because they like to see fiscal surpluses, or that we want for that reason. It is to be able, for Sri Lanka, to be able to achieve a level of debt, to convince the creditors that if we reduce the level of debt to this level, then the debt will be sustainable, and to agree to that debt reduction. So there, the timing of the speed is a trade-off. If you take longer, that means that you keep a higher debt for a longer time. You don't get as much debt reduction. Now, of course, that might permit you to have more growth in the meantime. But frankly, we don't have any growth now. And I think by delaying, we are actually risking longer periods of negative growth if we do that. So, and then on the other side, if we do it very quickly, then you could have a really massive contraction, and that's something the society really cannot tolerate. So the decision about the speed was taken balancing these two forces, and that's what we were trying to do. Now, we could discuss whether we made the wrong choices, but we had lots of macroeconomic models and data that that the fund was using, but in dialogue with us, and we had disagreements, and they made adjustments along the way. But I think we just have to appreciate that it's not just that longer time is better. It's got to be a trade-off between the costs of delay and the benefits of delay. Then the second point is about what Ravi asked about the composition of the adjustment. In Sri Lanka's case, there's no question most of the adjustment is on the revenue side. Why? Because most of the problem was caused by a drop in the revenue. The revenue to GDP ratio went from 12.8% of GDP to 8% of GDP, almost in a year, right? So we have to bring that back up. And by the way, Sri Lanka used to have a revenue to GDP ratio of 20%. So you can do it. And the other thing what we find is that there are huge untapped sources of revenue. So we can actually introduce, and let me just give you some examples. All the tax holidays being given to foreign investors. That's a huge source of revenue. These are not exactly poor people. And the evidence that tax holidays stimulate foreign investment, inward foreign investment, is practically zero. There's no evidence that's the reason. So then there's no justification, and parenthetically, it also contributes to corruption. Then on the expenditure, the composition of expenditure vis-a-vis poverty reduction, which Ravi legitimately asked about. And the thing again in Sri Lanka is, let's ask the question, how much of, not just how much of public expenditure is spent on the poor, how much of public expenditure is spent on the rich? Because that's where the cuts need to come from. So take fuel subsidies. 60% of fuel subsidies goes to the richest 20% of the population. So that's a public expenditure. That's an anti-poor public expenditure. If you cut those subsidies and give targeted cash transfers to the poor, then you're doing pro-poor public expenditures. The other big ticket item is state-owned enterprises. Sri Lankan Airlines. I think the debt to Sri Lankan Airlines is about 1% of GDP. Right? Now, which poor person benefits from Sri Lanka having a national airline? But think about what that money that goes to subsidizing Sri Lankan Airlines could do if we could spend it on poor people. So there's a whole host of pro-poor expenditures that can come from shifting the composition of expenditures towards the poor and away from the rich. And I would say, you don't have to listen to me. This is what the Aragalaya movement, which is a uniquely Sri Lankan phenomenon, said earlier last year. They called for accountability, the end of elite capture, and the empowerment of poor people. And that's what we're talking about when we're restructuring public expenditures. Then finally, the last point is on the international scale. Oh, I guess I want to make 2 points about the international scale. The same argument, but on 2 different points. When Nishan describes these Ponzi schemes, we should also ask the question, why weren't the projects of these international agencies delivering returns so that they could pay back the loans without having to borrow from commercial markets? So there's something going wrong with the actual implementation of public projects financed by international agencies. Then the second is this credibility, the credibility of commitments. And I would say that in both cases, the question should not be how should the international institutions, what role should the international institutions play? It's what role civil society should play, including the people in this room, right? In most countries, this kind of scrutiny, both on the productivity of public spending and on the commitment, the government keeping to its public commitments, is scrutinized by civil society. And it's civil society that calls their bluff when they do. Now, what the role that international organizations can do, and now I'm going out on a limb, but I have proposed this to the IMF, is that they can facilitate civil society's role as the guardians of legitimacy in this kind of scrutiny. And one simple example is that the IMF is currently doing a project on corruption, anti-corruption in Sri Lanka, a review. And I think this would be the ideal opportunity for civil society to write its own report. And the IMF, that's what I propose to them, is that they submit both reports to the government. They don't have to just submit the IMF report, which I'm sure will be much too polite and won't call a spade a spade. But I don't think civil society suffers from that problem. But the fact that it's jointly between the IMF and civil society might actually bring it some impact. I'm out of time.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Shanta, for that, for those observations. Let us now go to Jayati, continue the sequence of panel speakers.
Thank you very much, Ravi, and thank you very much, Verite, for inviting me for this very important discussion. May I request the organizers to please mute the room when one of the online speakers is speaking, because otherwise there is a very big echo, and we really can't hear online. If you could please just mute the room on Zoom. Thank you. Yes, so let me take up Shanta's very interesting and insightful comments, and I want to look at the role of the international agencies as well, particularly, I guess, the IMF, but all the IFIs, really, the MDBs as well, and then the nature of the responses. So, I think it's fairly clear that the IMF loan is not a solution. Yeah? It's a very small amount, 2.9 billion over 4 years. So that's what, about 720 million or 725 million or something over the course of 4 years per year. And that's at a time when you already have repayment of ISBs coming up, I think in April, of about 1.25 billion. So it's really just one drop in this very large gaping hole that needs to be filled. The idea, I presume, is that getting this loan will then be able to make Sri Lanka access a whole lot of other capital that will come flooding in, especially because people will believe in the IMF program. I think there is reason to doubt this program. I don't think these are viable numbers. I don't think Sri Lanka can achieve a primary surplus by 2025, even if they tax, which I'm very happy that Shanta mentioned, that taxing the foreign investors and so on. But in fact, the attempts to do the other kinds of things, which are raising revenues that are in many cases deeply regressive, and in cutting down in other kinds of spending, is going to cause a further decline in growth in the economy. And this is something that is very well known, that these kinds of attempts to generate fiscal discipline, typically, which are, if you like, pro-cyclical, they don't work in a situation when an economy is already declining. I think last year the economy fell by more than 9%. This year too, it's expected to fall by around 9%. So let's say there's a 20% decline in real income. You're squeezing more revenues out of that 20% decline, which really means you're cutting down on the capacity to spend or invest, which really means you will have lower growth. which means that therefore it will be even harder to generate the revenues, which means that when these targets appear unrealistic, you will then have to increase something or the other, but either some taxes or some more utility charges or some fuel prices, or you will have to cut spending. I cannot see this as a viable way out. I do believe that these counter-cyclical strategies are not, I mean, I think Ishac is absolutely right. You have to grow out of debt. To me, the gold standard for debt resolution is Germany 1953. The 70th anniversary of that was just celebrated. That's the way, in fact, you get rid of growth. You get rid of debt is by growing out of it. So one issue is whether this is a macroeconomically viable strategy. I don't think it is. Let's look also at the distributional elements of this. Shanta emphasized that this is actually progressive. But look at what we are getting. We're getting massive hikes in the price of fuel, in the price of electricity, which impact on all small micro producers. You're getting a massive increase in interest rates, and you're getting a depreciating currency, which will make all imported items go up further. So really, this is something that is going to squeeze ordinary people. It's going to squeeze micro, small, and medium enterprises. And that in turn has extremely negative effects for the macroeconomy, but also for distribution. So in that case, I would say that, there is a real problem of legitimacy. I believe most Sri Lankans do not see this as a legitimate government because, after an amazing Alagalaya, you basically got more of the same. Yeah? You got a change of face. Not fully new change, but nonetheless, you got a change of face, but the old elite still in command, so to speak. And Shanta mentioned civil society calling the bluff. Aren't they already calling the bluff? Aren't there strikes? Aren't there social movements? Aren't there protests, which are being repressed very, very badly as we speak? I would also argue that, this Ponzi, which Nishan emphasized so brilliantly, to me, that is a sign not just of Sri Lankan failure, but it's a sign of the IFI failure. I mean, surely, if Verite Research can identify these obvious gaps, the IMF should have known that this is happening. It was already happening in 2016 when they gave the next round of the last loan. Why was nothing done about these? Why are even today no proposals being made for taxing wealth, for curbing the illicit financial flows, which we know are occurring, for preventing exporters from not repatriating their export proceeds, and so on? There are many obvious measures which are not suggested. It seems to me that if we do want to avoid further political instability, if we want legitimacy and, if you like, buy-in, I think is the term the IMF likes, of the people of Sri Lanka, you have to do this differently. You cannot impose a fairly standard package on an economy that is in deep and sharp decline and in which people have been suffering really dramatically for the last 2 years and are now being told to tighten their belts even further, whereas, let's face it, the rich and the elites are getting off relatively lightly. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Jayati, for those observations and arguments. Let us now turn to Shamini Pure. Shamini?
Thank you, Ravi. Hello, everybody. Let me just start first by adding to what Shanta, I think, was saying we need to do, which I completely agree with, but I want to add a few more things. One is, and partly in response to what Jayati was saying, the way you get the growth going is you enable the private sector. I mean, Sri Lanka's private sector has been stymied at every turn because the public sector is so dominant. And as the public sector contracts, we have to turn to a private sector-led, export-oriented growth. I completely agree we need to grow out of this. So I agree with Jayati on that point. We need growth, and the way to do it is to let the private sector add to productivity. So this is, so the contraction of the fiscal needs to be also offset by structural measures to help the private sector to grow. The other thing that we need to do is strengthen the independent institutions. There was an example given, the central on the budget responsibility law, but we need to have a stronger institution building. The one thing that Sri Lanka has consistently done is only in the past 16 programs is only deal with the macro part. They have not addressed the structural parts, like strengthening our institutions, which have been eroded for the last 20 years. So, and what kinds of institutions are we talking about? The civil service, the independence of the Auditor General. There are a lot of specific things that I think will come out of this diagnostic review, the governance diagnostic review. And also, as Shanta was saying, civil society needs to step up and figure out what are the institutions that need to be strengthened. So I think this part is also important. The second thing that I think is that we need to help the private sector grow, stop the public sector from regulating every aspect of the economy. I mean, there are price controls everywhere. They help monopoly protected vested interests, basically have the rights to do a few things that we used to be a fairly open economy in the 80s and 90s. But now are much more closed. We restrict imports to not just during the crisis, but in other ways, so that we have essentially enabled corruption through protected markets. And it's a very anti-poor thing to do because it allows room for price gouging in various sectors, which is one example. So more getting out of direct price controls and more regulating things that have truly public externality benefits. So we have to change the nature of the regulation to ones where we are helping public externalities happen, rather than just simply enabling private producers to benefit from a lack of competition. And just to give an example of what I'm talking about, in 1960, exports to GDP ratio was 30%. It fluctuated. In 2000, it was 39%. Before COVID, it had fallen precipitously to 23%. That's not it's a gradual decline. And in 2021, it's at 17.7%. Sri Lanka is the size of Mumbai or Mexico City. There's only 20 million people in this country. We cannot possibly grow by protecting our markets. We have to sell to the rest of the world, and we can. Sri Lanka has an extremely strong, educated, skilled labor force, and we can compete on international services. There are a number of things that we can compete on. We are not a low-income country. We have something even now of about $4,000 a year in per capita income. So we need to step up and strengthen the institutions so that we can really become an upper middle class country. I regard this crisis as an opportunity to really fix the underlying problems, which we haven't done for decades. Let me also just touch very briefly on some international aspects of the debt restructuring problems, and just a couple of things. I mean, you can sort of say, why is the IMF central to all of this? That is how the debt restructuring rules of the game are currently set up. You do need a lender of last resort. So the IMF plays that role, and also it is to some extent a neutral arbiter of things like the debt sustainability analysis on which everything is based. So creditors have to come together and they have to have one analysis. And that happens to be the IMF. So it's not just the money, it's the fact that they provide the framework. Now, you might say, why didn't they fix some of these problems before? Well, you know what? The current program and past programs are very similar, and they are not one-size-fits-all programs. They're very tailored to what Sri Lanka needs. The problem is Sri Lanka never implemented those structural changes. Just simply does the macro stuff, gets enough of a break, and then abandons the program. That's exactly what we did in 2019. So we have to kind of be more consistent. And let me just say on the international front. So we need to it takes far too long for debtor countries to have a resolution. Debtor countries need quick resolution. And this is pretty clear. we are destroying value, we're causing hardship by, it's absurd to have 6.5, 7 months that countries like Suriname, Zambia, ourselves are needing to go through. This is new. It didn't used to be that way. The average time to the board was much shorter. It was about, according to Reuters data, was about 55 days, not the 180 plus days that we're experiencing. And that's because there are new players. And I, worked on Korea during the Korea crisis. And I can tell you that we went to the board within 2 weeks of landing for the first time in Korea. The request, we responded, we as in the IMF, I was at the IMF at the time, responded within a matter of days to the request. So the IMF can move fast if it wants to. It's just that implicitly the international community has decided that they're going to trade off certain considerations like intercreditor equity for speed. So while the reason we were taking so long is because the IMF has financing assurance as a part of its program. And before it can give a program, the rules say that it needs financing assurances, and it's very difficult to get financing assurances because the creditors don't, they don't want the other creditors to be paid on better terms than them. So here are some of my solutions to this problem. One is, I do think, and I can elaborate, the IMF needs to get rid of the financing assurances roadblock. The IMF should just have a small upfront disbursement, enough so it can react quickly, and then let the debt restructuring itself decide how much more it's going to disperse in other words, backload it a bit, because as Jayati correctly pointed out, the size of its resources are not the thing. It's the catalyst effect of it having the program. I also think that it's ridiculous that we can't publish the memorandum of economic policies once a staff level agreement is struck. We can't publish the DSA parameters. This is because the board of the IMF has problems with having the rest of the world know before it apparently sees it. These are easily addressable problems. And I think some of our discussion would be far more educated and informed if we had access to those documents, which are very tailored to Sri Lanka and have specific commitments on state-owned enterprises and corruption, anti-corruption, for example, and so that civil society can hold our leaders to account. The fact that it's secret for so long is a problem, so that can easily be attended to. Then on the comparability of treatment, I said intercreditor equity is a reason why debt restructuring becomes so long. Well, there's a paper by Buchheit and Gulati where they propose to introduce what's called the most favored creditor clause. And we can introduce it. In other words, whoever comes to an agreement with, say, Sri Lanka first, we assure them that any other deal that's struck subsequently is on comparable terms, and if not, we reopen that negotiation. In other words, this is simply very much like a tariff negotiation. So you can make this part of a standard debt restructuring. Now, there's also uncertainty on how much debt relief is needed. This is another thing that gums up the works in terms of having quick debt relief. I would say you need to have contingency clauses. So if growth turns out higher than expected, the creditor will get a bit more. If growth turns out to be lower than expected in the IMF's DSA, which is sort of the central agreed growth path, well, not necessarily always agreed, but the fact is you can have a contingency clause to deal with the uncertainty about growth. So if it's a lower than what the IMF said, then the creditors have to give a bit more restructuring. This would prevent the constant restructuring. I can see that Ravi is signaling to me, so I will end in a couple of, just one more point. We need multilateral mechanisms to ensure trade financing. Part of the economic collapse comes because of trade financing collapsing. And so the recent IFI loan to 3 private banks of 400 million that boosted some confidence, had some effect. And so that might be a model to work on. So I'm just giving some examples on how the international debt restructuring mechanisms could be improved so that we get much quicker debt restructuring, which is really something that would benefit everybody, creditors and debtors. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And please, for the audience and online and so on, please send in your questions so that we can post some of them. In the meantime,
Ravi,
let me just looking at really very interesting contributions from all panelists.
Ravi,
if I can divide the things up into three categories: one is macro, the other is sort of structural, institutional, and the third is international agencies. Under the macro thing, I think Shanta said the extent of the deficit or the surplus that's targeted and the speed. It's a trade-off between speed on the one. The reason why it's put that way is actually to get sustainability and therefore more access and therefore growth in the future and so on. So that's an issue. I think what are people's views, particularly Jayati and Ishac, in terms, is the trade-off got right? Is it, or what? Because that's one question. In terms of the structural and institutional, I think this is where we'll probably have the biggest differences of view. But specifically, I'd like to ask Jayati to respond to this point that in fact the subsidies, for example, fuel subsidies that Shanta mentioned, are very badly targeted. In fact, they're subsidies to the rich, not to the poor. What is the response to that, both specifically, but also in a more general analytical sense? And then we come, and of course, the institutional aspects, which I'll come to in a minute also. On international agencies, it's really fascinating listening to Shamini, how retirement from the IMF can open up one's views. And she made really to me, quite extraordinary, very sensible but extraordinary suggestions in terms of get rid of the financial assurances clause, publish the economic memorandum, all of this sort of stuff. And of course, that'll be very important for civil society to then play its role in this thing. But I think we're still left open with this question in my mind, and I put this to Ishac and Jayati, everybody. What then is exactly the role of international financial institutions in terms of conditionality, in terms of commitment, and so on? Is it everything to do with civil society? If it's not, then what is the actual combination? How do you see that? How do you see that working, particularly in the current structures that we have? And then, of course, there's a longer-term issue of how should the structures of these institutions change over the next decade or so to facilitate these things. Anyway, those are the sorts of points that I wanted to make. Are there any?
Ravi, just if you can hear me, just to
yes,
tell the online audience that while you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, there's a description or sort of caption area where there's a link. And on that link, you can write your questions. It's a Slido link, and you can write your questions. You can vote up other people's questions, and we'll get those questions over to Ravi so he knows what are the most popular questions, and he can put them to the speakers. Okay, so if you're online, just look under your YouTube or Facebook video. You'll find the link. Write your questions, or just text there if you need help. Ravi, just to let you, that's just a message to the online audience, but back to you, Ravi.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Nishan. But in fact, a question has just come in which relates to the international. So let me just also add that in, and then we'll go to the panelists to take this up. And the question really relates to the role of the multilaterals and the IFIs. One question that Jayati posed, which was, all this Ponzi scheme was going on in some sense on the IMF's watch. What was the IMF doing when all this stuff, all this borrowing was going on and so on, which Nishan laid out? That's one type of question which might ask. But the question online is, based on an analysis, it seems that we need to ask multilaterals to restructure their debt as well. Is this realistic to expect? So this is a fairly big question, and of course it won't be resolved for many, many years to come. So this is also a question that you might take up. So let me then go through to each of the panelists in the order in which they spoke to respond to some of these points, not all of them necessarily, but the ones that are most pertinent to your research and your analysis. Ishac?
I'll address one question, the question of speed versus depth, because it's a crucial issue. I think it's a design issue, and there is a design problem. Obviously, speed is important because the situation is very unstable. You need liquidity to stabilize the situation. The problem with the current process is that by focusing on speed, as Sharmini said, we're not focusing on structure, and we never get to structural change. We're always focusing on stabilizing the situation, and the commitments are not met, and we get a new program, and we never get to the structural changes, which is what will put the country back on a growth path to accomplish its potential. And it seems to me in the current process, the fact that when the IMF comes in, it already needs assurances. It already needs to know how much debt will be reduced. Is just too demanding. And then, as Sharmini said, we try to solve that by talking of a contingency clause, so that if things turn out better, we reduce debt less, or worse, we reduce debt more. This is too complicated. It seems to me we need just more time. So we need to have a process that's longer, a little bit like the HIPC process, phased, where initially the international community supports liquidity, gives the country time to stabilize, but also to have the national dialogue that will figure out the political changes that are needed, structural program that is needed for the country to come up with the national program that it would commit to, and only at the end of that phase determine how much debt reduction is needed. Now, the IMF cannot really play this game because it doesn't want to put its fund at risk. It wants assurances that the money it puts, it can get out, because others would have committed to that reduction early on. But by squeezing that game to that instant in which we are, I think we're getting an impossible situation. We should go back to the HIPC process that was multi-phase, gave space for civil society, the government to come up with a national plan, where debt reduction is decided later in the process.
This is a fairly big point that Ishac is making in terms of the 3+3, 3 years plus 3 years idea that HIPC put forward, for example. Shanta, your responses. We'll do a round of responses, then we'll go back to the online questions.
I didn't think I had to respond to anything on the macro side. Nobody, but I do want to say something about what Isaac just said. I take the general point that we need to do everything possible to get the structural reforms in place so that you can embark on growth. But I don't think there's a stark contrast between the things that you do to achieve stabilization and structural reforms. I think it's a myth to think that you need money to do structural reforms. In Sri Lanka, there are a lot of reforms we can do that are both conducive to stabilization, such as the reform of energy subsidies, but also pave the way for a more efficient economy that can then increase productivity. And let me just then address the structural questions that Jayati asked, because Jayati was saying that the austerity or the decline in growth is going to lead, it's not going to lead to tax increases, and micro enterprises will fail, I think was the way she put it. Look, there's one class of micro enterprises whose productivity we can increase in Sri Lanka overnight by the stroke of a pen. They're called smallholder farmers. The farmers in Sri Lanka, because of the Paddy Lands Act of 1958, are required to grow paddy, which is the least productive crop of all the crops. If we just lift that constraint, even if the whole economy is collapsing, they're going to be able to make more money, right? So why can't we do that? And that's conducive to stabilization as well as structural reform. And then on one other item on the tax, on the tax revenue.
Why was that? Why, Shanta? Why was that not part of this program?
Because it's politically impossible. It's been part of a program for about 20 years since the time I was the chief economist here. But it's just I even tried it a few months ago with a member of parliament who shall remain anonymous, and he told me to take a hike. But coming back to revenue sources, I mean, Jayati made the reasonable point that when an economy is contracting, it's hard to find sources of revenue from the flow of GDP. But there are sources of revenue from the stock. And again, coming back to the tax holidays. I mean, one was saying no more tax holidays going forward. But what about all the hotels and resorts in Sri Lanka existing currently, all of whom pay no taxes? So we're in a situation where if there's an increase in tourism, which there is today, that's good for foreign exchange, it doesn't do much for the treasury. So let's go back and revisit those agreements, those tax holidays, and some of these have had it for like 10, 20 years, and say, let's tax them. That's a source of revenue that's not going to be affected by GDP contraction. So let me stop there.
Yeah. Okay, Jayati, please, some comments from you, and then we'll go back to some of the online questions.
Yeah, thank you. There's so many questions here, and I think some of these responses have been extremely useful and important. So first of all, I just want to say I completely agree with Sharmini about transparency and speed, and I think Ishac made that point as well. I mean, these are absolutely critical failures of the multilateral system in a sense at the moment, and we're going to see this. Sri Lanka is not alone. We're going to see this in country after country, and we are seeing it already in about 8 or 9 of them. But I do believe the IFIs should restructure their debt. I think, Ravi, you asked this question. I think it is not a question just of the fact that, you have to preserve their credit standing and so on, because they've done it in the past. They did it with HIPIC without major, or rather without any damage to their credit standing. But I think there's also a question of accountability. The IFIs, let's face it, are often complicit, even culpable in some of the mess. And I do believe that is the case in Sri Lanka. I mean, it was very evident in the data that Nishan presented. There has to be some degree of accountability so that you're a little more careful next time in how you actually plan your programs, what you present, what kind of debt sustainability analysis you do. I mean, they must have done one in 2016. What on earth was it based on? So I think there is a question of culpability, and I think it's important for the IFIs also to take a hit in this, just to make them also a little bit more responsible in terms of their own actions. But I completely agree with Shanta about wealth tax, about the tax holidays for these, high-end services and so on. Absolutely, these are very easy sources of revenue and very important sources of revenue. But the fuel subsidies, and this is a very important point. It is so often argued that fuel subsidies only benefit the rich because in terms of final consumption of fuel at the pump, let us say, the rich consume more of it, naturally, because they're rich and they have bigger cars and all of that kind of thing. But fuel is a universal intermediate. It enters into the prices of everything else. It also enters into the costs of all the small, micro and medium enterprises that I have been talking about, and farmers' costs, and fishermen people's costs, and garment exporters, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, in fact, raising the price of fuel has a huge impact on costs. And without recognizing that and saying, well, they will continue to be competitive because meanwhile we are further depreciating the currency and adding to the domestic inflation, I don't think that is a viable solution. And in fact, if you look at Southeast Asia, that was not one of the ways in which they stabilized at all. They did not actually go for things that had that very regressive impact, particularly on small producers. Shanta, I imagine that the reason there's political restraint on shall we say, the requirement of growing paddy is for food sovereignty reasons. And I greatly sympathize with that. I greatly sympathize because we've seen what happens when countries are not food sovereign. I mean, all of you have worked in Africa, you know what can happen. I have seen enough countries suffering from major volatility in global food prices, which are often not driven by real factors at all, but driven by speculation and profiteering in commodity markets. So I do believe there is a case for some degree of food sovereignty. And if that's the reason for requiring some paddy to be grown, I don't see the problem with that. On the other hand, if you do want to reduce costs for farmers, don't increase their costs in terms of the fuel price, for heaven's sake. Or at least then have different categories for whom you are increasing the fuel price.
Okay, thanks, Jayati. So, we'll come back to Nishan later on. Has Verite done research on this, on the effect of fuel prices, taking into account the intermediate inputs and costs and so on and so forth? That's a question for you to think about, okay?
So, Ravi, can I come in on that? Yeah. Can I?
Yeah, why don't you come in on that, Nishan, and then we'll move to Sharmini, and then go back to some online questions.
Yeah, Jayati's question is a very good one, and Shanta and I have been in conversation about it because Verite has attempted this analysis. Unfortunately, the data we have, the adequate data comes like 15 years outdated, so it's quite difficult to do. And it's it's an important analysis which is missing and very hard to do because it's not about just the intermediate consequences, it's also public transport, for instance, and the take-up of public transport, who benefits, how that works out. And I think we have to say that it is almost an analytical question, right? So we should be careful how we analyze and figure out where the analysis exists. Shanta has access to and shared with us analysis done all over the world in different countries. But this problem of trying to quantify the incidence, especially in a public transport sense, turns out to be not as simple. Okay, so for the data available, also to say, well, who benefits from tractors, and there are also different types of vehicles you have to analyze. School vans are different from private cars, etc. But Shanta wants to come in on that.
If I could just add one factoid. So I've done this analysis for Thailand, for the Philippines, and for Indonesia, and using a general equilibrium model. So calculating all the second, third, fourth round effects. And it comes out to be less regressive, but still highly regressive. If you take in the inter-industry accounts, it still gets into to become a regressive subsidy.
Yeah. There's a question, Ravi, from the audience here. If I can just take one question.
Just a second, Nishan. Let me just go to Sharmini for her response, and then you can maybe come back with that question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sharmini.
Thanks, Ravi. So let me just make a couple of points. On the speed of fiscal adjustment, one thing that I think is really important to take into account is we have no financing. We can't just dream up a speed that doesn't exist. Okay, so we need concessional grant financing, and as a middle-income country, nobody is going to provide that. That is the reality. We can try to fix the system, but it can take years. So one of the things that drives the speed is the lack of financing. And as to, on Ishac's point on needing more time, I don't think this is a HIPIC case. We are middle income countries. The world is not, HIPIC costs $76 billion. And the length of time that it took is not something that anybody's going to tolerate for a middle income country. And why not? Because you have to finance that country until then. We have had 16 programs. We have had plenty of time to fix our structural problems. So what makes us certain that if you give another 5 years for Sri Lanka to fix its problems, or 3 years, that is going to do it? Our politicians are not to be trusted, to be honest. What they will do is kick the can down the road, as they have been doing. And then we can't at the same time complain about intrusive conditionality. The whole problem is fundamentally for a country like us is that we have to hold our governments accountable. It's not the job of the international community and IFIs to hold our governments accountable. We are a democracy and we can do it. And the Aragalia people got it exactly right. They didn't blame the outside world. They blamed their leaders, and they said they want honest, competent, accountable government. And we have now run it to the end of the road. So my basic thing is we've had all these years, constant warnings from the IMF. Read any Article 4 report from the IMF. They're all published. They have the DSAs, but we chose to ignore them. So I think you can't just sort of blame IFIs for not enforcing this on a country, and then at the same time blame them for being too intrusive. We're not children. We should grow up and simply accept our responsibilities. and implement the tough stuff. And unfortunately, we have now run out of road, and it's very painful. I'm not disputing that at all. That's why I'm talking about having a very quick restructuring. The other thing I would say, drawing from my experience at the IMF, is restructurings can be very quick, like I was saying, and countries like Korea grew after 6 months into the after the program started. Why? Because they depreciated their currency. All of Southeast Asia depreciated their currencies very significantly, and that allowed them space. They became very competitive in export markets and grew. And so Thailand, Korea, these are the cases we have to look at. Not Africa, not HIPC, not low-income countries. The middle-income countries are way too rich, unfortunately. We don't consider ourselves rich, but we are kind of, $4,000 a year. We're not exactly poor. So we have to have, the international community realistically is not going to finance us till we fix our problems for 3 more years, when for the last 16 programs, we didn't do that. So we just simply, as a civil society, need to hold our leaders accountable. One other final point, the letter of intent will be published on the 20th of March, hopefully when the IMF board meets on Sri Lanka, and that will give civil society an opportunity to go through that document, look at the timelines, and hold our leaders accountable to actually deliver on them. So I would say that's just one other thing in terms of IFI involvement.
Thanks, Shamini. That answers one of the questions online, which is will the DSA be open for public immediately after the board approval? Was also the question. So, okay, Nishan, why don't you perhaps Ishac, you could be thinking about the timing issue and so on. The question that you raised. Nishan, why don't you raise the question from the floor, and then I'll go back to the online
if we can
questions.
have Dharini give the mic, and does the online people hear that mic as well? Yes, okay,
yeah,
please go
working.
ahead.
Thank you. It's been such a rich discussion, and many points came up. I'm really delighted to know, Shanta, that there's going to be a corruption analysis, or that you're pushing the IMF to do something like that with civil society. Now, civil society has also been doing corruption analysis and looking at the different kinds of debt that exist, the ISBs, the multilateral and bilateral. And we find by far that the greatest level of corruption is in the ISB, because that goes directly into the treasury, and there's no trace of where those funds were spent essentially. And whereas with the multilateral and bilateral debt, they're usually targeted at some projects. The projects themselves may have some issues, and may be white elephants or whatever. But at least you can sort of trace where the money went to some extent with the multilateral and bilateral, whereas the ISBs are a complete sort of black hole in some sense. And it may have also ended up in the pockets of some of the politicians. So to that extent, the suggestion is to, since the most odious, which is the term that the civil society groups use, form of debt is the ISB debt, the idea is to sort of essentially ban or put a moratorium on future ISB borrowings, which will have a knock-on effect in terms of holding the authorities, accountable. And with regard to the important questions about, it's not really a blame game between international actors and local actors and who is. I think we all recognize we live in a globalized world, and corruption has a supply side as well as a demand side. And Eurobond traders are essentially money lenders, and they have their interests. And the Paris Club and the IMF, to some extent, represent their interests, because the end game of the IMF's entire negotiation is to get Sri Lanka back into that loop of borrowing more from ISBs. So there is quite a problem there with regard also to the data. And because, again, civil society groups are looking at the debt data. At the time of default, we were told that it was 26 billion that was, owed to foreign creditors. But then it went up to 30, then it went up to 31, 33. Then we were told it was 51, and somebody now said it was 76 billion. So there's this, and there's different kinds of debt. Then also it depends on the credit, debt to GDP ratio also becomes an issue there in terms of how and why the default happens. So, and also the the question about releasing the names of the bondholders, the quantum of debt they hold. All of this, if civil societies and Sri Lankan citizens are to pay off these bondholders, then accountability again is necessary to know who are these bondholders. We know BlackRock and there's JP Morgan and we know some of the names, but we need a full account. And this needs to be forthcoming.
Yeah. So three kinds of problems, right? So is there transparency?
One other point I wanted to make, and that is about geopolitics, which I think is really the sort of elephant in the room when it comes to Sri Lanka, because someone yesterday said that Sri Lanka's economy is going to shrink almost like Ukraine's. Ukraine is the worst case, and Sri Lanka is the next worst case. And I don't think it's an accident, because Sri Lanka is, in fact, in the midst of an economic proxy war between the established, financial system and an emergent financial system with the BRICS Bank, the new development bank, a new international financial aid architecture, which is also de-dollarizing, is on the horizon. And I think we need to be looking at that as well. So thank you.
So this question, I think there's a question, Shanta, that is, you
ISB
may want
question.
to answer about not just the ISB,
the corruption,
but also
ISB corruption.
whose side has IFIs on, right? IFIs batting on the side.
No, I don't want to go there.
Okay. But let me take that first question, Dharini, on the what did we borrow for? I thought that's the question I tried to answer in my presentation. That it turns out that all the borrowing we did, that net inflows of ISBs, but slightly less than the net inflows to pay interest on those and to settle project loans that you're talking about. Okay, so the fact is the government doesn't need to borrow internationally for it to be unaccountable. It borrows locally. You take the last week up to the 1st of March, it borrowed 20 billion rupees a day. Election costs only 10 billion, but the government was borrowing at the rate of 20 billion a day from the local rupee market. So whether it borrows internationally or locally, what the government does can only be traced through budgets and disclosures of the budget. And the budget does disclose, for the most part, what it does. But it's hard to find is when you spend on projects and there's cost escalations and bad procurement and corruption. So I think I just want to be clear that borrowing internationally doesn't make government uniquely unaccountable. And we have to really fix procurement and project spending to get the corruption under control. But I'll hand over to Shanta.
No, I mean, I'm just going to make an obvious point. When you say ISBs are corrupt, the most corrupt, because their money goes into budget support, and we don't know what happens with the money. What else is there in budgets but tax revenues? So all of you are corrupt. You're paying taxes into that same budget, and they're fungible. They go completely into the budget, and I'm sure some of it gets stolen, for sure. But to say that this one portion of the budget, which is the ISBs, is the most corrupt, whereas most of the budget is domestically financed. And it's coming from taxpayers in Sri Lanka. So they are the most corrupt.
Back to Ravi.
Yes, so I think Ishac, you put your hand up. Ishac, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's one element we're missing here. Debt grows relative to GDP when the interest rate you're paying is faster than the growth rate. It's important to keep that in mind. I think this must have also been an important factor in the growth of debt, because remember, the extra debt came from the market at high rates and from China at relatively high rates. So not just from multilaterals. So we're borrowing at 4, 5, 6, 7%, rates rising with time, and growth is not that much. And a big part of the current problem has to do with that the interest rate from the market it's not just unaccountable. It's part of that, but it didn't feed into high enough growth to compensate for these interest rates.
Again,
Ishac, do you want to? Sorry, yeah, Jayati, you had your hand.
I'm good.
Yes, I just want to, in fact, Ishac made this point already, but I just want to highlight that, it's the increase in interest rates also has that impact. It adds to government debt service as well. So the strategy of increasing interest rates further worsens the repayment requirements of the government, which adds to either the debt or the debt servicing burden. So in other words, some of the elements of this program are actually contradictory. You have to pay more in interest because you have raised interest rates.
Shamini, Nishan, let me just ask: are there questions on the floor there that you want to bring in after Shamini responds?
Yes, there is one, but you feel free to take another one online, and then we can come to the floor. Yeah.
Okay, Shamini, you had your hand up, please.
2 quick points on the IMF, being sort of favoring potentially ISBs and others. The IMF is actually essential for this role. You know why? The DSA that they produce, which you will see after after March 20th, is actually a way in which they get enough of a write down. And the reason that restructuring takes so long is because creditors, including bilateral creditors, by the way, negotiate very hard to try to loosen it. And the reason it's the debt thresholds are held tight is because the IMF is trying to get a better deal for the debtor, so that the debtor doesn't have to keep coming back for restructuring. So, this whole idea that they are all in cahoots is just not true. I mean, what is being done is to have a low enough thresholds on all the debt amounts that the creditors are forced then to write down debt, which they don't like to do. So, and these are, by the way, bilateral creditors too, not just the private ones. They all squabble about it. So that, I just want to make that point. A second thing is on this idea that we have to somehow, we can afford not to raise interest rates. Look, the simple choice is there are different ways you can finance yourself. Externally, domestic borrowing or inflation, if not tax revenue. So assuming, we're talking about the fiscal deficit, the tax revenues are spoken for, and we have yet more spending in excess of that. If we don't rate, the interest rates are high in Sri Lanka because monetary policy has to be tight. Monetary policy is tight because otherwise we will have inflation, because we have no external financing on concessional enough terms that we can prolong our fiscal profligacy. Frankly, we have been running deficits for so long, right? So we haven't generated the primary surpluses to afford to pay the interest on past borrowing, which is why we, as Nishan pointed out, we are essentially having a Ponzi scheme going on. So my point is simply that, this idea that you can somehow lower interest rates, continue subsidies, untargeted subsidies, and somehow the bill doesn't come to pay for somebody is not true. We are then forced to have inflation, which hurts the poor disproportionately. So granted, we are in a tough spot now, absolutely. I would say mostly of our own making, sadly. But the solution, there is no financing, there is no release of the constraint to enable us to get any further room. Unfortunately, we had many years to fix it and we did not. So this is the sad truth. That's why, we are in a situation we have to tighten the fiscal when growth is also contracting. And as I said, if you look at Southeast Asia, the examples that we have of also Latin America, frankly, in the 80s, which Ishac wrote this paper where you showed that, getting away from the import substitution policies actually helped Latin America. And it's the same thing for Sri Lanka. And Southeast Asia, which has always been much more export-oriented, the depreciation of the exchange rate is a way to help the private sector grow, is actually advantageous. Now, Jayati is completely right. It hurts poor people. The way to do that is to have targeted cash transfers and protect the poor and improve the structure of our expenditures such that we are not subsidizing general, through general price reductions, which help the rich, but rather through targeted means, and also not subsidizing these state-owned enterprises. We have 20 odd state enterprises in Sri Lanka, by the way, just to give you a sense of just how large our public sector is. And taxpayers in one form or the other are footing this bill. We are also sitting on 3 state-owned banks that have very bad debts because their costs have been hidden in those state banks, which have to be ultimately restructured, ultimately from taxpayer money in one form or the other. So hopefully this will happen over time. There's no need to panic, but the point is that there's no free lunch, as unfortunately for countries at our level of income. So.
Ravi,
thanks, Shami. Jayati, I'll come back to you in a minute. But if I may, there are a couple of questions online, actually targeted to Shanta and Sharmini, and perhaps to you, Nishan. If we take those, then we'll come back for a round of responses and comments and so on. Okay. The question is, it said the sender said this is a question to Sharmini and Shanta. What should be the roles of CBSL and the government now that the EFF is secured in the immediate and the medium term? So this is a question of the central bank. And secondly, where and when does domestic debt restructuring factor in? And what are the implications of the banking and financial sector? So maybe this is one of the online questions. To the extent you can address this, if Shanta and Sharmini, you could take this up. Then we'll come back to Ishac and Jayati to respond to the timing, the question, and the intermediate stuff and all that. Yes.
And there's one question from the floor here, Ravi, if you will take that at some point. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Shanta, Sharmini, please.
I'll start. Sharmini, help me out. Just a couple of highlights. I mean, obviously, the CBSL and the government have a lot to do to implement the program. That's just, signing on the dotted line is signing the letter of intent is just the beginning. So all of this matters. But let me just highlight 2 things. One for the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, which is the monetary policy law. We're trying to push one of the components of the program is independence of the central bank, to protect the central bank from the pressure that it has always come under to finance the fiscal deficit, precisely for the reasons that Shamini was alluding to earlier, because it's easier than raising domestic interest rates or borrowing abroad. The only way, my experience has been, the only way people have managed to protect a country where there's this chronic fiscal dominance, as they call it, is to tie the hands of the central bank. So when the finance minister comes and says, finance my deficit, he says, sorry, I'd like to help you, but they've tied my hands. I can't do it. So I think the central bank has a very important role, especially to avoid coming back to the IMF later. The government, of course, has a huge role in terms of all the structural reforms. This is going to be the linchpin of the growth process. And in particular, I would prioritize the state-owned enterprise reforms.
Thanks. Shamini, a quick response from you, then we'll go to the floor question, and then we'll go to Jayati and Ishac for responses.
Yeah, on the domestic debt restructuring, look, it is a subject of negotiation. You can be assured that the external creditors will ask for some domestic, it's about burden sharing, so they will want some domestic debt restructuring. We do have scope for that in this sense that you can extend maturities, and for example, within the central bank and other sort of things that are not necessarily going to hurt the stability of the financial system. And one of the things the central bank will look into, and with the IMF's and the World Bank's help, is the stability of the financial system. And frankly, no creditor, including the private sector, wants to destabilize the financial system because it's counterproductive to everybody. So this can be done in a way that does not necessarily destabilize the financial system. I know everybody's worried, and that's part of the reason, by the way, the interest rates are high, because the private sector is not financing the government except at a very high interest rate, right? So it's at 30%, even though the central bank lending rate is at 15-16%. So hopefully, when these things are resolved after the actual debt restructuring takes place, the interest rates will come down because that level of uncertainty is reduced. So we've seen this in other structuring cases. So I think there'll be more clarity on this. It's part of a negotiation on the total debt.
Thanks, Shamini. So Nishan, with an eye on the clock, if the questions from the floor could be asked quickly, then we'll go to Jayati and Ishac for responses.
A quick word on domestic debt restructuring. The Sri Lanka Economic Policy Group, where Shant and I both sit on, published a paper on domestic debt restructuring, authored by Professor Udara Piris, who's a professor economist at Oberlin College. And I think we'll put the link online so that people can read it, and I don't need to say more. The idea is that a stitch in time can save 9, so sometimes a mild restructuring early can prevent more troublesome restructuring later, and the math is worked out there, and the Excel sheets with the functions for anybody to play with and see whether the math can be done differently is also available online. I'll come to Pradeep from the ADB. Thank you for being here, and you have a question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I just have one question. I think most of the discussion is about restoring the macroeconomic stability and debt sustainability in Sri Lanka. But I think as somebody has mentioned, I think one way of coming out of this crisis is to grow out of this. So I think one of the key issues that Sri Lanka is faced with is that we have lost competitiveness. Sri Lanka is not globally competitive in any of the industries. If you take countries like our peer countries like India, they have a very competitive IT industry. If you take Thailand, they have a very competitive manufacturing and tourism sector. All these countries, even Bangladesh, has a very competitive garment industry. We don't have any such globally competitive industry at the moment. And that is evident by the fact that our exports are stagnant and we are not getting FDIs. So that's all sort of evidence that Sri Lanka has lost competitiveness over the last 15 or so years. So while this program would restore the macroeconomic stability, what are the measures that the government and the country has to take to restore this competitiveness going forward? That would require a lot of structural reforms. I think IMF program probably would bring us out of the intensive care into the normal ward, I think. For us to be cured, I think, from this disease, I suppose we need to restore the competitiveness. So I'll stop at this.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. Let's now turn to the Nishan. Could you give me some guidance on time, please?
So I think we still have another 10 minutes left, perhaps.
Okay.
Let's take.
Okay, so let's do the following. Let's do a round with the panel, and then we'll hand over to you. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So let's start with Jayati. Please respond as you see fit to all the things that have been said so far. Be selective, of course.
Yes, thank you, and I will also try to be brief, not just selective, but brief. I'm quite intrigued to hear that Sri Lanka is not an export-oriented economy. That was my understanding all these years, has been that it has self-declared as one, and that the international institutions' reports describe it as one. That it has been less successful in that in the recent past is a different issue, but it is certainly export-oriented. In the issue about inflation control, it really depends on what the causes of inflation are. And in the last couple of years in Sri Lanka, there's no doubt that a very dramatic step change in the inflation rate occurred after the massive devaluation and the global prices of food and fuel going up. And since Sri Lanka is an importer, it affected Sri Lanka it was a double whammy, so to speak. And there's very strong link between the two, right? So the current inflation is very strongly linked to that cost push, as the global prices are now back to pre-Ukraine war levels, as well, we hope there's not further depreciation once you have a market-determined exchange rate. But in other words, the impact of that depreciation will fade away over time. So you would expect inflation to come down anyway. To then claim that that's because of monetary tightening, I believe is wrong. In other words, this was a cost push inflation which played out. And it was a very severe inflation which has adversely impacted the poor hugely. And I completely agree with you that inflation impacts the poor. So I think we have to first recognize what the causes of inflation are. You can't use a hammer because that's the only tool you have for anything you see. You have to use different tools for different things. If it's a small cut, you need a bandage. If it's a larger thing, you need a different kind of tool. So, I mean, I really think we need to be careful about the idea that it's always monetary policy to control inflation. There's a raging global debate about this, as we know at the moment. But I do think we have to be more nuanced in terms of how we tackle inflation. It's not just monetary policy. The rise in prices of universal intermediates definitely would add to inflation. There's no question about that as well. Okay, finally, I just want to take up something that has been, I've been getting subliminally throughout this discussion, which is the use of the term we. You know, it happens a lot in India as well. It happens in most countries that are facing different kinds of economic difficulties. And there is a response of economic policymakers. We have to do this. We have been bad. We have made mistakes. We. Who is we? Now, you know, to an outsider, it really looks like it's the Sri Lankan elite is the we. And they are the ones who have goofed continuously for a fairly long period. They have been, let's say, aided and abetted by a global order that has permitted them to do so. And that they continue, let's face it, to be in control. Now, to then say we have to tighten our belts when a large part of that population didn't gain from this. And in fact, that's why you had an Aragalaya, right? That's why you had a massive public protest and social movement to say we are all, you know, cumulatively culpable, we, etc. When we know that there are huge protests that would be even larger if they were not being brutally repressed as we speak. I think there's something wrong there. We have to recognize that it's not just macro consequences for economic policies, there are distributional consequences. And if we don't take into account those distributional consequences, I think we would be failing as economists. Let me stop here.
Good, thank you, Jayati. So, Ishac now.
I think Jayati is amazing how she can move from the micro to the macro. I'm stuck on this issue of speed. So let me just stay on that. Look, I mean, the aspiration is clear, Sharmini. I mean, obviously, Sri Lanka should do much better. Should be more dynamic, be on a fast growth path and export and grow out of its problem. The problem is that it hasn't done that for years now. You know, as you said, you know, the SOEs, the state banks, the corruption. So now, of course, your answer is great on its face value. You know, it's our problem. We will fix it. Give us a quick debt reduction and shackle us. Whoever we is, we'll take care of the rest. You know, we're a middle income country. We're not a poor country that has to be shackled with conditionality. Well, I mean, I don't know. That is a question mark. I just want to leave that as a question mark. Politics take time. Politics doesn't adjust overnight. Elites are not displaced easily. This is really my Lebanon bias here. Elites are very hard to displace, and international support, bailout, whatever you want to call it, can strengthen them easily. And I think civil society groups like the one that are demonstrating may be able to take advantage of conditionality to displace them. So to have debt reduction conditional on a structural program within a certain timeline, I think for a lower middle income country is not treating them like a poor country. It's empowering civil society to play its role for that political change that takes time. But I may be wrong. I at least want to keep that as an open question for the months ahead to see how things move.
Thank you. So, Nishan, let me then suggest that we go to Shanta and Sharmini for some final observations, and then we'll draw it to a close.
Yes.
Sharmini, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Shanta.
Okay, thank you. Just some quick points on things that were left hanging in the air a bit. On why shouldn't multilaterals, I'm going back a bit, restructure their debt? Well, they are lenders of last resort. They are, you cannot ask them to then continually restructure their debt. The MDRI, they did do it once. As I said, this was during the HIPC initiative. They did write down for the poorest countries, but you know, you can't have them as lenders of last resort being subject to restructuring, because then the role is undermined. The second thing is they pass on low interest rates to all developing countries. They borrow at AAA ratings, And reason they have AAA ratings is that you can't default to them easily, and they pass on those low interest rates to all the developing countries. So there are a couple of reasons why restructuring multilateral debt is not a simple issue. I can also just say, coming back to the more recent ones, when I say we, I mean as a Sri Lankan citizen. I may be part of the elite, fine, but I'm also capable, and I think Shanta and I have been advocating for reducing the power of the elite. So I feel as a Sri Lankan citizen, long-term, what is the best for the country? So when I say we, I am trying to take the role of something that is representative of what is good for Sri Lankans, and it is not always a either-or proposition. So that's, for at least for me, what the we stands for. Somebody asked how do we make ourselves more competitive for export? By the way, we are not an export-oriented economy. Since 2000, I gave the numbers. Exports have shrunk from 39% of GDP to 17% now. That is an incredibly low number for a country like us. We need to get back to the 40s. That is much more representative of a small country, 20 million people. How do we do it? We will stop. And this, by the way, comes from work that Anne Kruger and Jagdish Bhagwati did decades ago. Stop protecting imports. Because when you protect imports, you create an anti-export bias because of the internal terms of trade shifts towards making imports more profitable. And look at us, we have grown in the last, our growth has come from services and protected industries. And we've run that course to, we can't go on like that anymore. That's why we are part of the reason why we are in this crisis. We don't generate enough foreign exchange. So we need to get back into being an export-oriented society by not protecting imports to the extent that we do. Like I said, always protect the poor people through better expenditure control, but do not protect imports and vested interests. So that is one way. And the other way is, the government could be much more, instead of giving tax holidays for services and other, things, they could provide explicit help to exporters in other forms that are actually helpful for them. And that could include, provision of electricity, making business easier to establish. We put numerous blocks on people trying to export or trying to establish a business. That includes small businesses. They can't grow. So we got to get rid of these kinds of restrictions. And I think that would help the export orientation. And then importantly, a more competitive exchange rate. Sri Lanka has a very, the real exchange rate is, we're not competitive because our fiscal sector is so large. And when you have a large fiscal sector, public sector, basically, that's another reason why you are uncompetitive. So let me just stop there.
Thanks, Shamini. Shanta, can you quickly make some responses, and then we'll bring things.
Yes, I can be quick because Shamini answered some of the questions that I was going to answer. But let me take Pradeep's question about competitiveness, because I think it's a good bridge between the stabilization and the structural reform agenda as well, because we need to do it in both. And in addition to what Shamini said, which is absolutely right, this used to be an export-oriented economy back starting in the 1970s. I mean, Sri Lanka liberalized trade in the mid-70s. I think it was the second developing country to do so after Chile. And the place took off. The growth rate literally doubled after liberalization. And the garment industry took off and a few others. But in the last 10 to 15 years, I don't know what Jayati refers to as the recent past, whether it's the last 50 years or the last 10 years. But in the last 10 years, clearly this has not been an export-oriented economy. This has been an anti-export economy, and it's due to public policies. They've been introducing para-tariffs. They've been introducing all sorts of restrictions on imports. I assume they're WTO compatible, but I'm not even sure of that. That have brought the trade ratios down, as Shamini was saying, 50%. But now, what do we do going forward? So I want to say, this is not simply reversing those policies. because there are at least two other things going on that are unique to Sri Lanka that should help in the design of competitiveness policies. One is demographics. This is a country where the share of the working age population is declining. And I think the absolute number will start declining in 5 or 7 years or something like that, right? So you don't have this sort of large manufacturing labor force. So you don't think about labor-intensive manufacturing exports the way you do, and people talk about Bangladesh, Vietnam, and places like that. This has to be very carefully calibrated to the demographics of the population. And related to that, any kind of the competitiveness, as to use Pradeep's phrase, any attempt at competitiveness is stymied by another feature of Sri Lanka, which is the public sector employment policy. I mean, basically, when there's a labor problem, the public sector solves it by hiring them into the public sector, right? And this has happened throughout history, right? And the trouble with the public sector, and I use that word deliberately, is that it's a guaranteed job for life with guaranteed pensions and all sorts of other benefits. So people are basically, those who are so-called unemployed are waiting in a queue to get that plum public sector job. What this does to competitiveness is it raises the reservation wage in the private sector. So it's very hard for private sector firms to compete in world markets. Even in the service sectors, by the way, they're having trouble competing. So unless we solve the public sector employment problem, and I would say if the government is halfway interested in competitiveness, they should stop hiring people in the public sector. And that gives the private sector a chance to grow.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed to our panelists. And let me say a few words just to conclude. Of course, it's been a very rich discussion, so there's no way one could summarize it and pick up all the nuances and so on. But I think there have been some areas of agreement, and of course other areas of disagreement. In terms of agreement, let me just, and I'm going to give you as examples rather than as broad categories. I think there's been absolute agreement in terms of transparency, that in fact the DSA, the debt sustainability analysis, and all of these sort of should be more public and should be made more public sooner, so that Sri Lankan society itself has a clear idea of what's going on. I think there's broad agreement. I think here, and that's very clear. Second, I think is that I think there are agreements on some things as being so patently wrong that one should address them. And I think tax holidays is one example. Tax holidays to the big hotels and so on is a small example of that, but actually it could be a small example, but with big revenue consequences perhaps. But if we could go down and make a list of those sorts of things on which there's broad agreement across society, from one spectrum to the other, that look, this is clearly wrong, and it should be. I think that might be a useful exercise that perhaps Nishan, your group could engage in, taking tax holidays as being an example. Of course, those are in some sense agreements, but there's also debate, and there's debate around the whole question of the fiscal deficit target and how quickly to attain it. So the timing issue, I think, is something on which we need to discuss. Of course, in some ways it's an empirical question. In other ways, it's a political economy question as well. And I think there's a difference of view on how much and how fast in this discourse. Second area, which I did again as an example, in which there's some debate, is how best to protect the poor in this period of adjustment and reform. And there are discussions about transfers in kind and cash, etc. And that's an ongoing debate. And we had a discussion about intermediate inputs, etc. And I think it's an empirical question specific to every country, and we should do more analysis on that. And perhaps Nisha and your team can do that. Then finally, I would say there are some issues that we didn't really touch, which Shanta, I think, touched on it right towards the end, which, for example, is present in the paper by Ishac Diwan and Danny Roderick and Reza Bakir, which is the long-term issues that are coming down the pike in terms of climate change, in terms of demographic change, in terms of the old growth model not being quite so salient anymore. and Shanta touched on this in terms of both demographic change and the demand for manufacturing output, et cetera, okay, the labor intensity of manufacturing. So these are longer term issues on which I think we will, all of us have to analyze and come to some agreement on, or some sort of consensus on, in order to help Sri Lanka and other countries devise their inclusive development strategies. So let me close there and hand back to Nishan to close the whole event. Nishan?
Thank you, Ravi. I want to say some thank yous and apology as well. I want to first say thank you to all of the speakers. I mean, I think we learned how valuable the investment you have made in thought, in deliberation, in articulating ideas for how to think better and solve problems better. And this conversation, I think, for me and for all of us listening, has been of immense value. So thank you so much for taking the time to participate. And Ravi, I want to thank you for doing such a great job of holding us together, for teasing out the important issues and then sort of separating the different strands in which we can make progress and in which we need more conversation. I want to apologize for many on the online audience that we simply could not take so many of your questions. I know there were large numbers of questions that came in, and the time just does not fit what we can manage. We had to just do a few questions. And I want to also just thank event productions who have run the whole online program here for us and managed it so well. And of course, for the team at Verite Research that are always able to, we say that, you know, the impossible they can do at once and miracles take a little longer. And for the speed and efficiency with which they've delivered, we are really grateful. And thank you, everyone who participated. And we hope you'll be able to share this video stream, which will be online, with others and use it as a way in the continued engagement and thinking forward for Sri Lanka. Thank you very much.
Verite Research is an independent think tank based in Sri Lanka, providing strategic analysis for Asia in areas of economics, law, and media. But our work goes beyond just research and analysis. We also develop innovative tools and platforms to promote transparency, accountability, and good governance in the country. Verite Research Sri Lanka Economic Policy Group comprises of top economists in the field, such as our very own Dr. Nishan Diwan, Dr. Shanta Devarajan, Dr. Dilani Gunawardana, and Dr. Mick Moore. They've published 6 data-driven publications covering a range of topics from taxation to debt restructuring to social targeting and governance. The main aim of this group is to both inform and educate the public as well as engage with the government and policymakers to assist in sound decision making. Publicfinance.lk is Verite Research's platform for public finance related information in Sri Lanka. It aims to bridge the gap in information and understanding of public finance by providing insights and analysis on Sri Lanka's public finance. We have also developed 3 interactive dashboards under publicfinance.lk to provide a real-time information on government performance, fuel prices, and infrastructure projects. Mantri.lk is another one of our innovations. It is the only one of its kind in South Asia, a pioneering trilingual website which profiles the actions and activities of each of the 225 members of the Parliament of Sri Lanka. Now, as a MP monitoring scorecard, Mantri.lk recognizes the need for accountability between MPs and the electorates. In doing so, it seeks to promote transparency and good governance to improve Sri Lanka's democratic framework. Finally, Verite Media, which offers a diverse range of platforms to improve public understanding of media and information in Sri Lanka. These include factcheck.lk, the media analysis, Front Page and Ethics Eye, which monitors and analyzes media practices and provides insights into the pulse of Sinhala and Tamil-speaking public. At Verite Research, we believe that research and analysis are only a part of the solution. We strive to develop innovative platforms and tools that promote transparency, accountability, and good governance in Sri Lanka.